The most widely produced armoured vehicles in history were the British Bren Carriers, the universal carriers. Built in about 110,000 vehicles in numerous variations. This was also one of the vehicles that the Dominions could manufacture without too much difficulty, Australia being one of them. They were also manufactured in New Zealand. They varied slightly from the original British specification to meet local manufacturing capability and also to use locally available parts. For example, the LP carriers, the local patterns, had Ford side valve V8s, cranking out 85 horsepower. A variant that the Australians came up with was the Carrier 2-pounder Attack, or Attack Carrier, or LP2A 2-pounder. It had a number of designations. This basically was a heavily modified Bren Carrier equipped to fire a 2-pounder, the classic British 40mm anti-tank gun. To do this, what they had to do first of all was they moved the engine to the front left of the vehicle. The driver stays in the front right, and on the back they created a mount for the 2-pounder and also found room for 120 or so rounds of 40mm ammunition. Further to the rear, we also see that there is a water tank. So in addition to fuel, you have water, so Australia being a somewhat arid nation, it's not a bad thing to have. I should add that the driver's position is rather unusual. He is basically sitting on the whole floor. He doesn't have a seat in the normal sense of the word. There's a small little cushion, and then there's a whole floor underneath him. The gunner had his own seat attached to the gun, and the other 3 crewmen would ride in the transported position forward of the gun, aft of the engine and driver. So when the gun goes into action, there are 3 full forward seats here. One is already down. The crew will get off, fold down the seat, and they rather neatly will disappear into the body of the vehicle, clearing the gun to maneuver. The gun is fairly simple. It's mounted behind the gun shield, gives basic protection against frontal fire, nothing from the flanks of course. And in fact the entire vehicle is barely going to survive even rifle fire, but at least the components will remain more or less intact. So unlike the 2-pounder you'll find on say a tank which is shoulder mounted usually, this one is purely geared, so elevation as well as traverse. Now, kind of a neat feature for rapid slew is if you partially depress this pedal here, you've now disconnected the hand gearing from the system. So you can now quickly slew around, assuming that your gun is clear of obstructions, to engage a new target. Let go of the pedal, and you're now back in a purely geared mode for fine-tuning. Very clever. In common with most universal carriers, and very rare for a tracked vehicle, is a steering system. So the first thing you do as a driver is you get in, you squeeze yourself into the vehicle, and your gear shift is on the upper left shoulder. You actually reach behind you to change gear. In front of you is your steering wheel. To steer, most tanks will simply change the speed at which the tank tracks will turn. If the outside track goes faster than the inside track, the tank will turn towards the inside. With the Carrier, however, and also the Tetrarch, the Electo and Harry Hopkins, they use a track deforming system, track warping. So as you turn the steering wheel on this vehicle, the bogie will actually move to the left or to the right and cause the track to curve. This will allow you shallow changes of direction without slowing down, no need for applying the brakes, no loss of power, and it's actually very easily controllable. Now, if you did turn the steering wheel hard over, however, this would actually lock one of the tracks entirely and you would pirouette more or less in place. This would turn you actually very quickly, especially if you're going fast when you started. There was a stowage compartment behind the driver for a Bren gun, should you need it, in addition to any extra rifles or some machine guns that the crew would have carried. Although the engine has moved to the front and there's actually a fair bit of room around it, they still have the drivetrain at the rear. So there is a prop shaft that goes all the way underneath the gun and goes to a simple differential in the rear axle. A fairly notable feature of the Bren Carriers was the very narrow pitch tracks. There's about 116 links per side, making it very, very flexible, although also a hell of a maintenance bear. All Australian attack carriers were actually the LP2A variant. The original local patterns were notoriously unreliable, and after a couple of tweaks and replacement parts, they actually got a working serviceable version together, and that was the 2A. About 200 of these vehicles were made in total, all at the Metropolitan Gas Works in Melbourne. Now, it turned out that they never saw service. They were designed primarily for emergencies, for home defense, when they were afraid that the Japanese were going to come over the water. And against Japanese tanks, this would have been an excellent system. The 2-pounder was more than capable of dealing with pretty much anything the Japanese had at the time. However, when it came time for service elsewhere in the world, especially North Africa, the end result was that the 2-pounder was just not up to the task. The British were being supplied by the Americans, and that trickled down to the other Commonwealth forces. The 2-pounder was considered obsolescent at best now against the later generations of German tanks. So there was no place anymore for the LP2. The vehicle simply was kept as a training vehicle from that point on. This is a vehicle that the Australians can be proud of. For what it was designed to do, i.e. carry the 2-pounder anti-tank gun, this was very good. It was mobile, it was light, it was efficient, it was locally producible. Carriers are always very popular with collectors because they're small, transportable, and the LP2 particularly so because not only is it small and transportable and an armoured vehicle, it's also got an anti-tank gun at the back. What more could he ask for? This particular one found its way eventually to California and is soon to find itself a new owner.